All right, well, welcome everybody to this last minute planned and very important event this afternoon. My name is Claudia Bornhold. I'm the Dean of the Edwards College of Humanities and Fine Arts here at Coastal Carolina University. And I am delighted that I got 6 of our faculty colleagues to agree to be here with me this afternoon to reflect, analyze on the events that happened yesterday in Washington, D.C. Obviously, never seen before events in the history of the American democracy. So what I would like to do is introduce our 6 panelists, and then we will go and I will ask each panelist to give a reflection, response, analysis of the events coming from their area of expertise. And we will then do a kind of discussion amongst the panelists, but then we will leave plenty of time for the audience on Facebook Live to ask questions, which I will read out, and then we'll take them as they come in. So by all means, please, if you're in the audience, post your questions and comments. So let me introduce our speakers. I will do this, as I said, in alphabetical order. Our first panelist today is Dr. Joseph Fitsanakis, who is an associate professor of intelligence and national security studies. He comes to Coastal with a PhD from the University of Edinburgh, and his area of research include intelligence collection, human intelligence, communications interception, information security, cyber espionage, political violence, information operations, and privacy. He has written extensively on intelligence collection, information security, cyber espionage, and sub-state political violence. His books and scholarly articles have been translated into several languages and referenced by media outlets such as the Washington Post, NPR, BBC, ABC, and Newsweek. So I'm delighted to have Dr. Fitsanakis with us today. The second panelist is Dr. Drew Kolowski, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Politics. He joined Coastal with a PhD in political science from the University of Missouri and an MA in government from the University of Virginia. Dr. Kolowski's research and teaching interests focus on campaigns and elections, election law, voting behavior, political parties, and American political thought. He is the author of Rules Matter, Election Law Revealed, and he has a book on election law in press. Dr. Kolowski is also a frequent contributor to the media. The third panelist is Dr. Matthew Mcdonough, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of History. He has a PhD in American history from Kansas State University. Dr. Mcdonough's research focuses on 19th century America, westward expansion, and American military history. He teaches a variety of survey courses and upper division classes in our Department of History on topics such as American military history, the Civil War and Reconstruction, the American frontier, and also a course on Atlantic piracy. The fourth panelist is Dr. John Naven, who is a professor of history. He has a PhD from Brandeis University and an MA in American Studies from Boston College. Dr. Naven's scholarship specializes on early American history, and he has published works that focus on race, warfare, gender, and the impact of colonizing ventures on groups and individuals. He teaches courses on crime and punishment in early America, critical moments in American history, and the Vietnam War. Our fifth panelist who joined us, and we're really lucky and happy to have her here, although she's currently actually on time off, is Dr. Holley Tankersley. She's a professor of politics and also the associate provost for strategy and development at Coastal Carolina University. She holds a PhD in political science from the University of Georgia and a master's degree in public policy from Georgetown University. Dr. Tankersley's research and teaching expertise are in public policy and political institutions. In her scholarship, she focuses on the intersection of institutions and public policy, and she examines the way in which institutional structures and characteristics shape political outcomes and policy outputs at the state and national levels. She teaches courses on public policy, social policy, American political institutions, and gender and politics. And our sixth panelist is Dr. Wendy Weinhold, who is an assistant professor of journalism in the Department of Communication, Media, and Culture. Dr. Weinhold has a PhD from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, and her research is in the areas of journalism, critical media and analysis, and women and gender studies. Her work focuses on the changing definition in US journalists in the digital age. Dr. Weinhold comes to Coastal Carolina with more than a decade of experience as a journalist, serving as a reporter for newspapers and public radio stations in Nebraska, Illinois, and South Carolina. So I would say this is a fantastic group of experts we have here who bring very diverse backgrounds to this discussion. And what I would like to do is maybe just continue in alphabetical order and ask Dr. Fitsanakis to start us off with his.
Thank you, Dean Bornhold, for initiating this panel discussion. I think all of us have gone through what is perhaps can be described as the most important 24 hours in the political history of this nation in quite some time. It's also a bit personal for me. As many of you know, our program, the intelligence program here at Coastal, specializes on preparing students for careers in intelligence and security. Many of them are in DC, and I just found out in the last couple of hours that at least 2 of them were injured. 2 former students were injured yesterday's events, one in the Secret Service and one in the Federal Protective Service. So forgive me if that is a bit close to home for me. I'm not going to speak very much about the political aspect of this. I'll leave that, among other aspects, to my esteemed colleagues who are here today. I will say a few comments about the security aspects of these happenings that we witnessed in the last day or so. Many commentators tend to see this as the kind of the culmination of a violent campaign to destabilize the American political system. I see it a bit differently. I think it's actually the beginning of such a campaign, the opening shots, if you will, of what I think is going to be a broad insurgency. And I use this term very precisely because it does denote a mostly violent rebellion against state authority. Some of its parts are decentralized. Some of its parts are very centralized, armed. They use guerrilla tactics to achieve their goals. Other parts are kind of all over the place. They're leaderless. I think what we saw yesterday, the people that ransacked the Capitol were mostly part of the latter. They lacked order, they lacked coordination, they lacked direction. In fact, I spoke to one of my colleagues, Dr. John Smith, yesterday on the phone. He used a great metaphor for this. He said it's like a dog that catches up to the car that it's barking at and is not sure what to do at that point. The mob were not quite sure what to do once they entered the building. However, I want to caution everybody not to confuse that group with a more organized part of this insurgency, what one may call the armed wing of the militant portion of the Trump movement. Groups like the 3%ers, the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys. Most of them have military experience. They understand tactical maneuvering and command structures. They have lots of weaponry. And at this point, they're actively planning an armed insurgency against the state. I will close with this. Many political commentators, I think, saw what happened yesterday as a massive disaster for Trump. That may be so politically, but in terms of security, this is not how this is going down. I think January 6th will go down for these groups as the storming of the Capitol, as symbolic opening shots of what they see as the Second American Revolution.
Great, thank you so much. I'm gonna hand this over now to Dr. Kolowski.
All right, hi. Thank you again for organizing, and I'm really happy to be here today. So I guess to be able to bring my particular expertise to bear, a couple of things that I think are lost in the discussion of what happened yesterday was what the business of the Congress, the business that the Congress was engaged in. So this is my particular area of interest, electoral law, Congress counting or certifying the results of the Electoral College. And it's interesting because there's actually a few different things that are, I think, that are taking place in an effort to disrupt that count. And, you know, I think a couple things strike me. Maybe first, the resiliency of the institution in completing that task, albeit at 4 a.m. the next day. But also, I think maybe a misperception on behalf of those who were engaged in the disruption, the insurrection, and Professor Fitsanakis sort of gets at this when you know what takes place once you get there. You take selfies and, I don't know, look around through papers. What does the delay of the certification of the electoral vote actually mean? And you know, I don't necessarily have a definitive legal answer, but I'm not so sure that it would have meant a whole lot. You know, so we can get into this in Q&A, but safe harbor deadlines, which privilege the results of the states as they are transmitted to Congress, were met. All these dates were met by every single state. You know, to be sure, election challenges were going to be heard on the floor of the Senate and the House. But those challenges were unlikely to yield any differences in how those returns were going to be accepted. And the date, I mean, I've heard a little bit about the date, that the 6th is this important date. There's nothing to say that we can't count electoral votes on another date. It's happened before. It happened in 2012. The 6th fell on a Sunday, so we counted the votes on the 4th. We ostensibly would need a piece of legislation to pass to change that date. But again, it's not really clear what a disruption of the count would have done. And again, I'd love to talk about maybe more of the procedural aspects of what happened yesterday before, you know, in terms of thinking about the objections in particular, and thinking about the procedure for how those objections are handled within the Congress. But then I'd also maybe like to think about what's happening maybe moving forward. And I've fielded a lot of questions in the last 12 hours, 24 hours about the 25th Amendment and about potential impeachment. And I'd again be happy to field some of those. I would say I'm not sure exactly if you know, time constraints are going to allow for a complete impeachment and removal of the president if there's that will in Congress before the inauguration of Biden on the 20th. And I think that there are a number of incredibly difficult hurdles to clear if Vice President Pence decides to pursue the 25th Amendment option. But again, I'd be happy to talk about either of those two aspects. And I think from my view, focusing on yesterday and focusing on looking forward, maybe the bright spot is how the resiliency of our institutions allows the count to continue, would have allowed for a continuity of government. So again, my sort of areas of input would be happy to talk about in Q&A.
Great, thank you so much. Excellent, wonderful. Then I will ask Dr. Mcdonough to go next. We're switching a little between politics and history here, but I think that's great. Just have the different angles on this. So.
Yeah, thanks for having me. You know, good thing for all of us is politics and history are essentially intertwined here. So I'll try to limit my comments to a relatively specific window of the historical perspective. So obviously, first off, this was an unprecedented assault on American democracy from within. But from a military perspective, this is one of the most cataclysmic and insulting things we've seen to veterans. So many American veterans have fought through countless wars for the concept that we hold dear, which is the representative democracy. And this was essentially shattered by a group who numbers in at least the thousands and probably somewhere in the hundreds of thousands to millions of people who at least tacitly support such an attempt to essentially overthrow the elected results of an election. Historically speaking, that's not necessarily totally new, right? There's been a lot of people who've been upset with elections. What was different here is that it was condoned and exacerbated by the sitting president, of course. And that, I think, changes the ballgame quite a bit. But specifically, one of the things I found rather startling and alarming more than almost anything, from a historical standpoint at least, was the imagery that we would see from the mob who insulted us by attacking our seat of government. And some of the symbols of power they carried were Trump flags, putting them in place of the American flag, which leads to the cult of Trump and echoes very dangerous territory into authoritarianism, even into fascism to a certain extent, but also the Confederate battle flag. Considering that Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis spent 4 years and hundreds of thousands of lives trying to get that flag into our Capitol, and they failed, only to see it walk in with relatively limited resistance, is a horrifying outcome and an utter insult to what it meant and what it means to be a Republican. The party of Lincoln was not the ones desecrating our seat of power yesterday. That party, I don't know if it exists, and it certainly doesn't exist in the way that Lincoln thought it did. And this was rough for those of us who are in tune with what's going on. I can only echo kind of the concern from General Mattis, who realized the significance and the dangers that Trump and his rhetoric has posed, and what endlessly claiming false information can lead to. One thing to take comfort in, I do believe, is that our military, the United States military, has historically been very apolitical and has continued to stay there. And they've made it very clear that they will not be taking on a more active role in putting down, say, a BLM rally, as Trump attempted to get them to do so, which is, I think, very good. The failure of law enforcement, on the other hand, to contain what happened here, as compared to what we'd seen in other rallies in DC and other places, is extraordinarily disturbing, but outside of my area of expertise. The final point, I think, should speak to the actual attempt to disregard the election under the idea that they were the people attempting to decertify Biden's result were invoking historical precedent. And that's actually not exactly true. The historical precedent that they were referring to was the 1876 election. But why Congress ended up deciding that particular incident is because 2 different slate of electors were sent by those states. And so they couldn't just say, oh, well, the state of South Carolina wanted this individual. That's not what happened. They sent 2 different electors for 2 different candidates. And so something had to have been done. In this case, there was no such dissent from the states. Every state very clearly sent which candidate their people voted for. And so to try to use that as an argument to say that this was following historical precedent is misguided, to say the least.
Great, thank you so much. We talked a lot about revolution, right, and the historical precedents and the second revolution. So I think having Dr. Navin take over now is perfect. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Maybe coincidentally, this coming semester, one of the courses I'll be teaching is titled Riots, Rebellions, and Protests in American History. And I don't want us to get too tied up in semantics, but one thing that I'll be asking my students on an ongoing basis is, was this a riot? Was this a protest? Was this an insurrection? Was this a rebellion? What would you call this thing we're studying? Because my students are going to be looking at between 60 and 70, let's say, social or political or military movements within the United States of various kinds and definitions. And So in looking at the mortifying events of yesterday, I had this kind of analytical bent coming in where I was trying to figure, well, exactly where does this fit? If I go back to Dr. Fitsanakis, he used, I think, the word insurgency. And just to lay this out quickly without getting into too much detail, I would say that American history is rife with or filled with protests. Protests are part of our political culture. We all have the right to protest. It's a lawful act. And many protests are peaceful. Even if these events hadn't happened yesterday, we would have plenty of protests in the last several years that we could discuss. At what point do you say, well, that's not a protest? Look, people were doing things. They became violent. They caused destruction to property or even threatened others. If we talked Black Lives Matter, many protesters, but then some people broke windows and broke into stores and so forth. And I would point out there will always be in a group, there will be people who have more radical intentions or exhibit more radical and illegal behavior than maybe the majority of the group. And even when we're talking semantics, what do you call a group versus what do you call a mob? And in some cases, what do you call a cabal or something, a mob with even more sinister intentions? So when thinking about what we saw yesterday, you could say, well, there was a rally, a lawful rally happening down the street from the Capitol that you could say, well, that was a protest. When the leaders of a group or the leaders of a protest then steer the participants in a direction that it becomes violent, that it involves a threat to property or to individuals, then it's no longer just a protest. Then it starts to take the form, if it's out of control, it's a riot. If some control continues to exist, then you might start talking about whether this is a rebellion or an insurrection. You know, we talk about the Boston Tea Party, we call it a party. It was very planned, very organized destruction of some tea. Those same Bostonians several years earlier had a riot during the Stamp Act where they went into the lieutenant governor's house, threw all his furniture out the window, and chased him and his family out of the house at the threat to at the danger to their lives. So what did we see yesterday? I would say that for the most part of the thousands of people there in Washington to protest what was going on in the Capitol building, they were protesters. But then a lot of them went from that category of protesters to participating in a riot. Was it an insurgency? Was it an attempted revolution? Well, I don't think the leadership was there during that action to call it a revolution or an insurgency. It wasn't directed well enough. What we saw President Trump and some others do is they incited it, but then they lost control of it, or they never had control of it. And this is, I guess it depends on what you want to call more dangerous. Some attempted rebellion or revolution that's directed by its leaders who will continue to direct it, or was this something that was incited but then got completely out of control, and maybe the leadership either what was no longer effective, or the leadership lost, they had no further goal. So I'll stop there, but I just want people to think about, you know, was this something that we could say this was a deliberate action with a deliberate end, or was this some kind of spontaneous action by a mob, an out of control mob that is not likely to happen again? Because if the leadership was there and they were controlling or directing these actions, there's nothing to say that that won't continue, and those leaders will continue to try to do that very same sort of thing. On the other hand, if this is a protest that got out of hand, then there's a lot of law enforcement and other measures that can be instituted, and hopefully with no organized leadership, we can keep it from happening again. Scary things to think about, but that's where we are.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Then I will ask Dr. Tankersley to go next, please.
Thank you, Dean Bornholt. Thank you for organizing this. It's so important that we talk about these issues. And I think the more timely, the better. So I appreciate you and the invitation. Gosh, so much has already been said. I guess I would, I want to organize my thoughts into kind of three points. The first one is, you know, my area is public policy. And when I think about this from a policy perspective, at first you may think, well, this has nothing to do with public policy. In fact, it has a lot to do with public policy, because as Dr. Mcdonough and Dr. Kurloswki both stated or implied a couple of times, a lot of what happened yesterday is rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of the United States Constitution and the policies that govern not just our electoral system, but our political system as a whole. And people expressing frustration, anger, whatever those emotions were that we saw them trying to express yesterday, come from a point of miseducation or misinformation, right? So when we don't have a fundamental understanding of public policy or law or the Constitution, we open the door for people to be able to spread more misinformation. I think that speaks both to a lack of civic education in the country as a whole, and a failure on the part of elected officials to communicate more clearly and to not use very clear matters of law and policy as kind of subterfuge for their political power and their political purposes. And so that concerns me deeply, right? I mean, of course, as a person who studies public policy, I think everyone should understand the laws and the policies that govern our nation, but particularly these, the ones that lead people to be susceptible to misinformation, and to think, as Dr. Kolowski said, that they could do something to stop the count, or as Dr. Mcdonough said, that they were doing something that is supported by historical precedent. So that's the first thing that comes to mind for me, is this role of information about public policy and civic education. The second thing that occurs to me is that although I've told several folks in the past, I try not to venerate the founding fathers because they were just humans like all of us. George Washington was absolutely right in his farewell speech when he left the presidency. He talked in that speech very famously about why political parties would be a scourge on American government and political life. And one of the reasons that he gives in that speech for his disdain and fear, frankly, of political parties is that they could be too easily usurped by individuals for self-interest and personal gain. So he's thinking about leaders of a party who would use the machinery of the party, not for the party's sake and not for the sake of citizens or the people, but for their own self-interest, their own self-aggrandizement, and their own wealth. And I think we've seen now, certainly, I have to believe the death of the Republican Party as we have known it in our adult lives. And we see now a devotion to a single individual that has grown out of that party because he came to the presidency from that party. And so I find that troubling. And, you know, I think certainly that the party machinery as it is, or as it were, of the Republican Party, to see where that goes from here, for me, will be an interesting thing. And then finally, I just, like Dr. Fitsanakis, I'd like to say on a personal note, how heartbreaking it was for me. I'm sure, like many of you, I have been in the Capitol several times. I've been in those chambers. They really are sacred spaces in American civic life and public life. Usually when you're on a tour in the Capitol and if you're lucky enough to go into the chamber or by the chamber, it's a hushed moment. People don't speak loudly because there's an understanding that that is the source of our government by law and not of men. And to see it defaced and to see people treat it like, I don't know, a happy hour spot was really heartbreaking for me personally, and I know for many of you as well. But I know that, you know, we will find a way to navigate through this very difficult period. And I hope that we can find ways to come together to move past this.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Tankersley. And then last but certainly not least, Dr. Weinhold.
Dean Bornhold and colleagues, I just want to say I would love to be in any of the classes of any of the folks who I've had the opportunity to join on this panel today. It's a lovely, lovely conversation. So one of the things that I think I bring to this conversation is an interest and expertise in activism and in First Amendment and social media. And I've heard a lot of conversations about these people being protesters. And as somebody who is an activist and has been an activist, was in Washington, D.C. in 1997 for the Promise Keepers March on Washington. I was there as an intern for the National Organization for Women. And I was in D.C. in 2008 for President Obama's inauguration. And it is a hallowed space. It is a safe space. It is a place in our nation that I'm really proud of. And the moments that I have been there have been significant moments. I mean, I lived in DC as well for a period of time, and it is a city of order, and it is a city that is well policed. So what happened yesterday wasn't activism. What happened yesterday wasn't protest. These were pirates. They were not protesters. They were not interested in doing activism and changing people's minds. They were interested in destroying things. They were criminals. And that's critically important to understand, that what they were doing doesn't have anything to do with activism. Ultimately, thinking about social media and about expression, what were they doing? They were creating content for social media pages. They were giddy and foolish and looked like idiots as they destroyed some of the most sacred spaces in our nation, and did it with what I can only hope are truly failed measures that ultimately I hope result in criminal arrests and convictions, and certainly that these people, these criminals, these protesters get at least as equal of treatment as people who've been protesting in Black Lives Matter, people who've been protesting in Me Too, people who've been protesting for climate change, who did receive significant policing. And when it comes to issues of organizing, issues of protest, issues of free speech, that's not what these people were doing. They have freedom to come to Washington, D.C., to protest, to express their concerns. They do not have the freedom to try to change a moment in democracy. They do not have the freedom to endanger our Capitol. They do not have the freedom to endanger the Vice President or the members of Congress. And so I think that there's some really important questions that we need to ask about how misinformation got to them so effectively that they thought that it was okay to do this. And that gets to some really important questions that relate to some of my other interests, related to gender, related to toxic masculinity, related to whiteness and privilege. I mean, these protesters demand that we really look ourselves in the face as a nation and say, is this the direction we want to continue heading? And I hope it's not. And I'm glad to get to be here talking about it today.
Thank you so much. So we have had now so many very important angles on this. We have a lot of questions coming in. So I think what I would like to do is start going through some of the questions, because I think a lot of what we've heard will come back around through that. So, and I'm just going in order. The first question I have says, I was watching a former intelligence officer today question how such a secure building was not prepared for anything to happen. How do we have all of the intel capabilities and nothing was done to prevent any of this? if this was a well-planned terrorist attack, this could have been catastrophic. Something does not add up. So that is a question, of course, we have seen and asked all of us. We all asked that question, right? How is it possible that the doors of the Capitol building could have been breached? So I don't know if anyone, this is in many ways a little intel related question, but it is obviously more than that as well. So maybe Dr. Fitsanakis wants to take a stab at it.
I will say very quickly that this country doesn't have a long history of people attacking symbols of power in a militant fashion. It has happened some in the 60s and 70s, but nothing of the type of thing we saw yesterday. As a result, many of these targets are soft. They're not very well guarded. And the question about intelligence, unfortunately, even though I and many others in the field have been pressing for this for many, many years, our intelligence and security agencies are not as skilled in monitoring far-right militancy as they should be. Not to mention that recently, in the last couple of months, many of these far-right activists migrated from mainstream social media like Twitter and Facebook into conservative-friendly social media like Parler and Gab. As a result, much of the intel that we typically collect on those groups that tends to come much from social media had basically fallen into a black hole in the past couple of months. So I think that intelligence was lacking, and there's no tradition or history of guarding buildings of this significance from the American population itself.
Great. Yes, thank you. There is a kind of second part to this question in the Facebook chat, and that is actually referring to something Dr. Weinhold was talking about. A commenter said, I've seen peaceful ACA and BLM protesters dragged out of the Senate offices or gassed to clear the route for photo ops and so on. So the question is the same question really. Why was there such a small amount really of police available or of security available? And that's been discussed widely. And I think another connected question that we've seen here is the why were these protesters, rioters walked out peacefully and so few arrested? Because the number of people arrested is, as far as I've seen today, at least, still very low. And I think there was a question in the chat on that as well. So I don't know who wants to, maybe Dr. Weinhold wants to take a stab at this one.
Oh, the joys of forgetting to unmute. Yeah, so I'll definitely take a stab at this. I mean, I think that these are really important questions. And one of the only things that I can give in trying to be positive and trying to think generously toward the police and the military who were there is that it was of greatest interest to our country for the Congress, the members of Congress, and for the vice president's lives and their staffs to be protected. And a Capitol building can be rebuilt, and we've done it. Second, that ultimately what they did in not drawing their weapons, and I mean the military and the cops, what they did in trying to tone down the protest and do it without violence is not make martyrs. And that, if anything, may have helped to tamp down the fuels of the flames that the Dr. Fitsanakis has brought up and has us thinking about. And so I really do want to give praise to the members of the military, praise to the police who were there, to the National Guards, because it could have been so much worse. And we could see people raising valid questions about freedom of speech if all they were doing was walking on Pennsylvania Avenue, which is what Black Lives Matter protesters have done, right? With different results. And that's why it's really important for us to think about questions of race, think about who gets to have space in our nation's capitals, who gets to have space as a citizen, right? Who gets to be counted, whose voice gets to be heard. And I'm really thankful that the police made the choices they made that ultimately didn't give more volume, didn't turn up the volume more to the protesters, but instead kept our eyes on getting back into the halls of Congress and making that vote that ultimately is, as Dr. Kurloswki said, such a testament to the power of democracy.
If I could add something to this, I think what we also saw here is the difference between a predominantly white group of protesters and those of minorities in this country. Many Americans do not want to deal with this reality and sidestep it. But I think this does emboldened a lot of these rioters and this mob to greater action, because they're in no danger. Why would they be? They've never been in such danger. They don't see law enforcement as something that would perhaps harm them, where you do see that in many other communities in the United States. And I think, there is some hope to all of this, in the sense that, these are soft targets, just as my colleague said, and that's absolutely accurate. And that's good, right? This is something that we should be proud of, that we don't want to become a police state. We don't want more armed, riot gear clad law enforcement in every location. I think what we don't want to fall into the trap of is, well, we saw a lot of these BLM protesters who were trying to take down monuments. They take rubber bullets to the head. We want these guys to pay. No, I don't think that's what anybody should advocate for. And I don't think anybody is, but it's important for us to recognize that I think we just don't want the BLM activists to be treated differently than how these guys were treated. And that's the real failure that took place here. Not that these guys were not taken care of, but that, why are we not treating others in the same respectful, peaceful, try to bring down the level of harm at the same level? There were clear attempts that you see from many video feeds and cell phones, et cetera, of law enforcement attempt to de-escalate. You did not see a ton of de-escalation in some of these other riotings that took place earlier in the summer. I don't know where we go from here, so I'll leave there.
Yeah, if I could piggyback onto that just for a second, though. I mean, I think you're right on that, but there's also the reverse. It's not about the crowd's perception of how they'll be treated by police, and I think maybe this speaks to perhaps our perception of the lack of preparation in advance, is that law enforcement agencies clearly did not see the protesters as a threat. And on top of that, to get at Professor Fitsanakis, I don't necessarily know that the intelligence, there's a failure of intelligence. I think, I've seen pictures on Twitter with people who have the shirt, they had merchandise printed up with the date and the time. I mean, it's not a secret what was happening. And we knew hours before, as the president says, let's all head down the street. So, and to be fair to Capitol Police, I don't, they're not a law enforcement agency that's trained in the sort of crowd control techniques that might have been necessary. And after, particularly after the dispersal of protesters in Lafayette Square Park, there might have been some apprehension about a forceful military presence. But I do think that there is probably a reduced perception of danger from this group of protesters, which might have led to a little bit of a lack of preparation, or a lack of, if there was fear, true fear. And then again, I don't want to delve into conspiracy theories or not. I obviously cannot. None of these things go anywhere towards answering questions of why, members of law enforcement might be taking pictures with protesters or anything like that. But it's clear that there will be investigations, and from what I understand, Sergeant at Arms and Capitol Police leadership have already been are being held responsible for these failures right now. So I think we'll know more about how to answer these questions in the coming months.
Great. Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Naven.
I'm not sure if it's my turn here, but I'm going to get a few things out there. Unlike the rest of you, I'm old enough to have been involved in protests against the Vietnam War back when I was a college student between 68 and 72. And I think back to the Kent State massacre, as some call it, when the National Guard was there in force and with loaded weapons. And when I think about that and other protests, or in some cases what some people might call riots over the years, you have to look at the government response. In some cases, it's state governments. In some cases, it's federal governments. When we're talking here about why weren't we prepared to defend the Capitol? Why weren't we better prepared for crowd control? In this case, one thing that makes this so unique is this protest, this riot, this mob action, whatever you want to call it, this insurrection. This was actually initiated by leaders of government. And we can certainly point to the actions of Trump and the actions of other people on the platform yesterday who gave the immediate incitement, caused that group to move down the road. But, you know, you have to look at months before that, this whole argument that the election was fraudulent, even in the face of all these judgments by courts and in the face of recounts, everything that pointed to the fact that the election was legitimate, yet it's still the president and other high officials and members of president supporters, I'll just say, who continue to spawn these allegations and to use the media to their advantage and to our national disadvantage, or to our national harm. They uniquely, if you will, were main causes, main actors in this action, this riot, for the want of a better word. And I think if you look at all the riots and protests going on in American history before this is truly unique in terms of the national government being behind this. We've had certainly actions where states and groups within states were behind actions that we consider reprehensible, but never have we had anything where the president and senators and congressmen over a span of months contributed to this sort of mentality and anger that would spill out in such a way as it did yesterday. I think one thing that we might ask is, was there an intention to overthrow or obstruct our government, our democratic processes, or was this just some protest that got out of control? And the difference there is, if you look at the leadership and look at what their intentions were, did they intend to undo our democratic processes? In which case you would say, well, this was, as Joseph might say, an insurgency or an insurrection, as opposed to a riot or a protest gone bad.
Yeah, and I just wanted to follow up and kind of think about what Dr. Naven just said as well. He was talking about a complicating factor in this is, or a mitigating factor in this is the potential incitement from within. I would bring up another that kind of speaks to the question about police and preparedness and security. And that is that the Capitol Police is sort of unique from a policy and governance perspective, right? They're kind of the police force that's supposed to protect the legislative branch of government, the mall, the surrounding areas. It's an incredibly secretive organization that is overseen by the Congress itself, right? So there will be a lot of investigations, as Dr. Kurloswki said, and probably a lot of reflection on the way that we govern Capitol Police. But the other piece of this that has to do with security, and I think this is what concerns me most, given some of the things Dr. Fitsanakis has brought up, is that the policy and governance in the District of Columbia is incredibly complicated. And it's complicated because, of course, DC is not a state. And so there are questions about who has jurisdiction where, who can call out the National Guard, who's National Guard, when they're called out, who commands them, what police forces have jurisdiction in what spaces, how are they trained differently, what are their functionalities and their specialties. I mean, this is a huge kind of tangle of thorns to have to work through from a policy and governance perspective, but it is absolutely critical to figure that out if we're going to enter a period of insurgency or rebellion, because that will come up again and again, not just from a who's responsible or accountability perspective, but also from a funding perspective and a command perspective. And that's a policy and governance issue to think about moving forward.
Great, thank you so much. We have so many questions. I'm trying to sort through them a little bit, but we have a couple on the role of social media in what has unfolded. Obviously, I mean, the whole Trump presidency was very much marked by the use of social media, but also yesterday. So one question is, do you think a certain segment of the population does not have the ability to distinguish between facts and conspiracy theories? Is social media to blame, or at least partially to blame? Have we moved from teaching critical thinking strategies to standardized test taking? There's a little move toward all of us educators here. So, so I don't know if anybody wants to go first on that one.
Well, I can certainly talk to the role of social media in all of this, and we can look back to activism in the 1960s and think about the ways that our various sort of civil rights protests protesters and activists understood the power of the media, the power of journalists in getting out really important images so that people could see what had before been unseen. In many ways, social media has harnessed that power today, but what it does is allow a lot of people to work in spaces that only they see, that are unseen and unavailable to many of the rest of us. Now, as Dr. Kurloswki pointed out, this was not a surprise. There was no unseenness to what happened yesterday in social media. And yet what we don't see, if we aren't following QAnon, or we're not in various sort of Twitter circles or social media, the dark web kind of spaces, is we aren't really aware of how much fuel is being added to the flames. But all we really have to do is look at Donald Trump's Twitter feed from yesterday, right? I mean, of course, we can't look at it right now because it's been suspended, thankfully. But if we were able to go back, we would see that over and over again yesterday, as people had overtaken the Capitol building, were breaking windows, were causing destruction, were engaged in violence, Donald Trump was either silent, or he was continuing to insist that the election had been rigged, that he had won this by a landslide, and that what they were doing was being patriots who were beloved by him for their work. And that kind of activity on social media certainly does have significant power to incite distrust, to fuel misinformation that is really, really hard as a professor of journalism to combat. I mean, I literally have students who sit in my classrooms and say, well, I just believe something different. And all I can answer is, well, then you don't believe facts. And I know they don't like to hear that very often, but the truth is, if we aren't able to agree on what is fact, and today I think it is easier and easier, in large part thanks to social media, for us to have alternative truths, to use that phrase. If what we are doing is being fueled by our beliefs, being fueled by ideology, then we you have to really get harder on critical thinking, teach more about the importance of asking questions. And social media, one of the things that I think is really easy to miss in social media is its human aspect. The reason there is so much power in social media is the same reason there's so much power in any kind of communication, because humans are doing it. And when it's your neighbor or your dad or your buddy from Vietnam, or your friend from whatever war, or the person down the street, or your teacher, or your coach, it is much harder to understand that those beliefs are not factual, and that it requires a kind of trust that I think has in many ways been broken today in our country. We don't trust journalists in the same way that we used to. It used to be that being a journalist was one of the most powerful and most well-respected careers. Today, journalists rank about the same as car salespeople. In terms of respect and in terms of the trust that Americans have for them. And that's a really sad commentary when the person we shouldn't be trusting is the president. The journalists who are bringing us the truth about what happened yesterday, those are people that we should be trusting. And as a professor of journalism, it really does hurt my heart to have people questioning the motives of journalists, the motives of media. But because of social media, they're able to do it in ways that the flames just keep getting bigger on their fires. That's about all I have to add to that.
Great. Thank you so much. We have some very specific questions. I think I want to go quickly through some of these for specific panelists. So I just need to find them again. So here's a question for Dr. Naven. Many of these hate groups have falsely attached themselves to labels of patriotism and 1776. How does this distort American colonial history? This is coming from a proud alum from the class of 2019. Welcome to the group here. Go.
Yes, that comes from Brandon, a good student from Coastal. And hello, Brandon. Thank you for the question. I think that it doesn't distort history, but what it does do is it shows the delusions, or if that's too strong a word, the wrongheadedness, I'm going to say, of some of these protesters. I think that the idea that patriotism in this case might involve trying to prevent Congress from doing its lawful duty, carrying out its legitimate functions, is hardly patriotic. And to make any reference to 1776, a revolution, historians will tell you that a revolution involves usually a change in government, okay? So if you're going to talk about this as being a revolutionary moment in American history, what you're saying is that the people involved, the actors in this, are seeking the overthrow or change in government, and certainly not by peaceful means, because the only way to change our government by peaceful means is to do it at the ballot box and to have Congress do it with amendments and so forth. So these people are obviously misusing these labels. What I find most concerning when you see some of these claims, or people wrapping themselves in the American flag and claiming that they're standing up as true patriots, is the degree to which that they have bought into the misinformation and lies that's been fed to them. And I'm also a lot concerned that there are so many people who, despite the plethora, despite the amount of evidence that we have that the elections, for example, were legitimate, that Joe Biden is legitimately our next president, was chosen so by the people, that they refuse to believe this because they think that there actually must have been or actually was some kind of fraud, some kind of, the election was stolen. That's what you hear. The election was stolen. That they could still be believing that. I don't think this is just false rhetoric coming from everyone. I think a lot of people still legitimately claim, or as far as their mindset goes, they believe that this election was stolen in spite of all the evidence. And that's really disconcerting and disappointing, because if you take all these steps, if you recount the votes twice, if you have Republican governors and officials standing up and saying, no, this was legitimate and we're ready to certify this election, and the people still won't accept it. For one thing, you tend to lose faith in the mindset, the national intellect, if you will. But the other thing is, you say, where is all this distrust and misinformation coming from? And again, you look at our leadership. This is unprecedented. Politicians have always had their own axe to grind, had their own message to deliver. But in this case, it's one that works against our national interest, against the interests of our country and our government. And it's just mortifying, for the want of a better word.
Yeah, and on that, sorry, just to chime in for 2 seconds, and on Dr. Weinhold, thinking about social media and thinking about the need for additional, I do think that that's great, additional critical thinking, but Professor Navin sort of, the source of a lot of this misinformation, whether they truly believe it or whether or not they are also falling victim to the same sort of disinformation online or through social media, is being driven by the elite political class, which is not undereducated, right? Which are, Josh Holley, who was a professor of law at the university where I received my PhD. It's like, these are not people who lack critical thinking skills. Are they just as susceptible to the nonsense, or are they willful participants in this disinformation campaign that is being amplified, to be sure, by social media? But anyway.
Just to jump into, like, what has been disarming and distressing for certainly the last 4 years for me, and I'm sure for many people, is simply the lack of logic in so many of these statements and movements and rhetoric that we hear. And I'm not and this is not like I'm offering expertise here, because I don't have any. It's just to take, for example, this current Stop the Steal notion. They want to invalidate the election of Biden because they insist that Trump won, because these ballots were tampered with. But they will wholeheartedly accept all the down ballot Republicans who won, which just strains incredulity. Like, it's beyond any comprehension that this could somehow line up. So you also have simultaneously Democrats are this evil cabal of pedophile ring, conspiratorial, whatever. But then they're so inept that they let all of their Democratic down ballot candidates lose in this great attempt to steal the election. And so, are they incompetent, or are they, I don't know. I got nothing.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I want to shift a little bit to what comes next, because a lot of our questions are going in that direction, the immediate next. So it was touched, someone mentioned at the very beginning, there's a lot of talk about potential impeachment or invoking the 25th Amendment. So that's one of the questions we got. Another question we got is there a precedent? Is there the ability and precedent for Trump to pardon himself? So that is a very direct and concrete question. And I think I want to kind of close this out by thinking what will happen with the new president, and what options does Biden have to really move forward from this low point really in American history where we are today, and how do we bring bipartisanship back and into this country? So I don't know if anyone wants to start with a very specific question on Trump's right to pardon himself, or if there's any precedent. historically?
I can try. No, there's no real precedent. You know, there's some question as to whether that is possible. Obviously, he could say, yes, I'm going to use my pardon power to do this. But there's some questions as to what the constitutional intent of that language really means, whether or not it could be challenged. So no, there really is no real precedent for it. Certainly presidents have pardoned family members, but that is not really the same thing. So we would be in uncharted territory there. With respect to some of the other issues, I agree with what Dr. Kurloswki said earlier. I'm not sure that there's really time for another impeachment. And besides, if you're in the House of Representatives and you're a Democrat, you do not want another impeachment if you're unsure of a conviction in the Senate and removal, because that would just be disaster for a number of reasons. The 25th Amendment, you know, it's a little more complicated than it seems at first, because the president has a chance to respond. Congress then has to consider the response. It requires a supermajority vote, you know, so I think what you're likely to see instead is kind of 13 days of chaos, 13 days of wondering who's in charge and what's going on. And I hate to say that, because I know it's going to make a lot of people feel stressed and anxious, but I'm not sure that any of our remedies were meant to be put into place with such a short period of time to go before a new president takes office.
Yeah, Dr. Naven, go next, please.
Yes, I'd like to, I guess this is a question more than a statement. One concern I think a lot of people have is regarding President Trump's continuing control of the military as commander-in-chief. And I think a lot of people are inclined to say, oh, with 13 or 14 days to go, we can get through that. And yet, if you think about the fact that this man still controls our military, that kind of could change your thinking. And I wonder if Dr. Fitsanakis or any of the other panelists might have an opinion on, do you think, at the risk of ruining their careers and even being tried for various crimes, would the commanders of the various armed forces conceivably collude, I guess, or decide on their own that they would not carry out anything that they considered to be rash or uncalled for in terms of major military actions? At this point, when you have a president who's being challenged and questioned in so many ways, is the military still 100% loyal to him and willing and able to carry out whatever directives he gives? That's a question, and I'm afraid what the answer might be. I'd like to hear it, though.
I think, Dr. Naven, obviously, I think we all know that the military is not required to follow instructions from a commander-in-chief that are illegal. But at the same time, I'm more concerned about if the military does act a certain way, will it be united in acting a certain way? Or will there be division within the military? Because that's how civil wars actually begin. But I think before we get to that, I think the constitutional limits and precedent that Holley talked about as well is going to be tested severely every day between now and the 20th of January. And that will continue, I think, I'm afraid, even after that day. From the security perspective, I also fear of what Dr. Naven, you mentioned as well, John, when you said that the pieces of the puzzle that we have are not yet complete. We don't know who else participated in this attempted riot, insurrection, insurgency. I tend to see it as an insurgency, a riot that was in the service of a broader insurgency. And I think would be kind of blind if we focus on just this event without looking at the context. So I think the people, I want to remind everybody, the people who did participate in this riot yesterday don't live in DC. They actually live in every state of the nation, and they're on the way back as we speak, galvanized and very energized by this experience. And I believe that we're going to see a lot of actions of violence where lethality, unfortunately, will not be an exception from now on. Now, what would the military do in that situation? That's the mystery that all are faced with right now.
I think maybe I'm perhaps more optimistic, but I am fairly confident that the United States military will not be participating in any attempted Civil War coup or any such notion. And I think most of us would agree with that notion. The real question is, if Trump asked them to launch a strike against Iran or something to stir up additional foment problems, would they carry it out? And again, I'm going to go back to, I am supremely confident, especially in the critical thinking skills of the upper echelon of the military. They're extraordinarily well educated through both civilian and military branches and schoolings. And there is, I find, almost an impossibility that they would do something that would severely jeopardize Biden taking election on the 20th. I think everyone is aware of the tumultuous time we're about to go through, and to launch a strike at that exact moment, I think is going to be a hard sell to a lot of these professionals. I think stay calm is the point, at least from the perspective of the military. They are not loyal to a man. They have never been loyal to a man, with the exception of probably George Washington. And since then, they have been propagating the notion that they serve the Constitution and the American public. And thus far, they have demonstrated that time and time again, with generals standing up against these principles, like General Mattis, saying that we're not going to participate in these endeavors. And I think, if nothing else, that should give us some comfort. The same thing happened with our court systems. Time and time again, it was tested with dozens and dozens of lawsuits, and it came out intact, as did Congress itself by finally certifying the election of Biden. So while our institutions were tested in unprecedented manners, they stood firm, and they will continue to stand firm.
There could also be a quickening of that 25th Amendment process, as the Secretary of Defense would be one of those cabinet members who if wind of a potentially illegal or outrageous order came down the pipe, that very swiftly the 25th Amendment could potentially be invoked if that was the case. But I think there's probably a middle ground here of optimism and pessimism. And I see that Dr. Bryan had asked the question, how significant is a failed coup? And I do think that it is, regardless of what we label it, it is wounding. It is deeply wounding. And if it's, I think that the consequences, we won't be able to see for quite some time, because I don't think we're going to be able to know how we will respond to the trauma. But the inviolable nature of the Capitol and these, that's I think that is wounding, that is damaging to the nation. And I'm also struck. I wish I knew how many students we had, but our current students are living in a time where this sort of chaos and extraordinary events are almost becoming routine. And I would hate for us to begin to lose sight of how this is dramatically out of the ordinary, just because we have become so desensitized to craziness for the past 2 decades, right? And just in general, and much more in the last 4 years. But our students have never known a political world that lacks that chaos. So I think it's going to be important to figure out how the country responds to this wound. But I think that a failed coup, if that's what we want to call it, is deeply wounding, is deeply damaging. It again goes to normalize, and I think without some swift retribution, and it's going to normalize this sort of extreme protest in DC. Although it is not the first time. I see Dean Jadala had also mentioned a few of previous examples, and let's not forget that this has happened in DC before. In 1968, in the wake of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., there were riots. There were 13 dead, arson all throughout the town, 1,000 fires, if not more. And the damage done to the city was prolific. But the city came back, right? The city did come back. And some of those neighborhoods even better than before. So I think there's room for hope there, but the hope will not come without hard work.
And I just want to, go ahead. Oh, are you sure? All right, okay. So I just want to follow up on what Dr. Kurloswki said, and say that the damage and the wounding that was done to our country, I think also, and I hope, is a damage and a wounding that has been done to our social media. I mean, I hope that Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and the various spaces that can just kick people out, they should take any of those protesters with their photos who were there in Nancy Pelosi's office, in the halls of the Capitol building, and they should be removed. Twitter and Facebook aren't responsible for the First Amendment. They are responsible, though, for what they're doing for our country, and they are under, I think, a really important, or they should be held under a cloud of shame right now for the role that various social media places have played in accommodating this kind of behavior, accommodating this kind of speech, this kind of misinformation.
I'd like to just bring one point up, if I could, and that is, we can talk about the implications of yesterday's actions and whether we'll recover, how long it will take to recover, and so forth. But one thing that we should all keep in mind is we can blame Donald Trump or hold him accountable for certain things yesterday and over the past 4 years, but Donald Trump did not elect himself. And the conditions in the country, the political conditions that put Donald Trump in office still exist. The divide in the country still exists. And I think if you really are looking for a fall guy, if you're trying to go back to the problem, I think it was Holley who talked about George Washington warning about factions, right? We've had a dysfunctional political system where everybody in Congress seems to have to toe the line of their party. People aren't voting their consciences, they're voting as they're told to vote. And that's not the way our government is supposed to work. And that at least in part created what people started to refer to as the dysfunctional swamp. You'll recall Trump was going to come in to clear the swamp. Well, people were really upset with a government that couldn't get anything done, and that seemed dysfunctional. And when it did act, oftentimes the outcome was not good. And people, I think, many Americans were just upset with the way our government was working or failing to work, was failing. And that's how a person like Donald Trump was able to get into office. And so we might get rid of Donald Trump and we can overcome the events of yesterday, and we can fix up the Capitol, and we can learn some lessons and beef up security. But that doesn't heal the division in this country. And I think, so going to, I think, Amanda Bryant's question about a coup attempt, whether or not this could be labeled as a coup, this certainly was manifestation of tremendous anger in this country and a real sign that there are problems, deep-rooted problems that thousands, millions of Americans maybe are not ready to come together at this point. And that in a lot of ways is probably the bigger concern. Donald Trump will go away. Getting that divide to go away, that anger, that resentment, that distrust of government that maybe should be traced back to the 1960s, that I'm not sure how you get that to go away. Hopefully Joe Biden will give it a good start and a good try.
Thank you. I want to follow up on this with a question we just got from Anelia Barnes, the chair of the history department, who asked if our panel experts think that this event will encourage the two parties to reach across the aisle more for cooperation, or will it further deepen the divisions? And then she says, it seems to me that a functioning and better respected legislative branch is crucial for recovery. And that connects a little bit to the how can we move forward, right? How do we get out of the situation we find ourselves in? So this is obviously speculation because we don't have an answer to this, but maybe just a little look ahead.
I hope that we will see additional cooperation and more working across the aisle, as several panelists have brought up and Dr. Naven just spoke to as well. It certainly seems from last night, and I know kind of in the heat of the moment, you know, things may change, but it certainly seems from last night that there are a number of members of Congress, particularly in the Senate, who, whether they had a last minute change of heart that was true or whether it was out of self-interest, you know, are making some statements that they recognize that this has gone too far. Now, whether that translates into actual collaboration and negotiation and bargaining on legislation that matters to Americans and that makes their lives better, I think remains to be seen. But I think that you probably will have a handful of senators on the Republican side in particular who will move faster away from Trump than perhaps they would have a year ago or 2 years ago, and not be quite so concerned about the Trump base of the Republican Party. The House of Representatives, what did it end up being? 123 members of the House who voted against certification or who voted in favor of the objection. You know, that's still a minority in the House of Representatives. 6 senators who ended up voting on the objection, right? That's a significant minority in the Senate. So I am hopeful. I'm optimistic by nature, but I am hopeful that that is a sign that we will be able to see some change and some movement. I'm hopeful in particular because Joe Biden spent all of his political career in the United States Senate. He understands how the legislative process works. And I think he may be able to spur some cooperation and collaboration from that perspective. And frankly, given the electoral results in the state of Georgia yesterday, I think the Republican Party has a reckoning. They have to understand, and I think they are understanding, that if they continue obstruction and that if we don't address some of these conditions in the country that are creating this anger among the electorate and among citizens, that they're going to be in real trouble. So I am hopeful, but it won't be an easy road. As Drew said, it's going to require hard work.
I think at the end of the day, everyone, left to right, Republican, Democrat, they want the same thing. They want economic prosperity to whatever degree, and they want safety. And if the incoming administration can attempt to move reasonably on both of those tracks, I think we could start to see more cooperation. I think, you know, I know one of the first things that they were mentioning is that, well, now that they have the 50 senators, they want to introduce the $2,000 aid package to each American to weather the coronavirus. I think that has bipartisan support. And so things like that to help us get through this horrific double threat, both internal and external, from virus and our own viruses, As long as we keep those things in mind, I think we're in good shape. And the vast majority of Americans were not ransacking the Capitol. The vast majority of Americans decried that violence. Even if they had supported some of the BLM movement, they decried it this time. People who thought, well, they went too far, but we didn't like the BLM violence, they still thought it went too far. And so the vast majority of Americans all agreed this was messed up, which is good. I think we have a lot more in common than not. And if we keep that in mind, hope could be on the horizon.
Let me add something as the resident pessimist of the group. I am less optimistic than what Dr. Tankersley said and Dr. Mcdonough said. I think that if Dr. Naven is right and the division in Congress and the leadership of the country is a symptom of a broader problem in society at large, then even if Congress starts getting more together, it won't necessarily solve the root of the problem, which is the population. And another problem that I see is that some of these radicals inside the Trump movement are not at this point operating within traditional party lines. They're not even Republicans. They're actually Trumpists, if you can call them anything. And right now, going back to the security aspects of this, if I wanted to protect specific office holders, my big concern is not going to be the Democrats, it's going to be Republicans being targeted by extremists of the Trump movement, right? In addition to that, yes, you're right, Matthew, that the vast majority of Americans were not riding at the Capitol. Yet early polling is showing that something like 45% of all Republican voters are either strongly in support or in support of the attack on the Capitol. Now, even if a number is 20%, 10%, that's a huge number. And it doesn't take that many radicals to disrupt society as we know it. The problem with some of these groups, such as, for example, the Boogaloo Boys, is that they are accelerationists. They don't believe the system can be reformed. And the only way you can change it is to tear it down to its roots and start again afresh. And that is really our biggest problem. Many of these groups that used to be marginalized in the fringes of society, because of what's happening in the country as a whole, that Drew mentioned as well, this kind of crisis that we've lived under for the last 20 years, they're coming increasingly in contact with parts of the mainstream. And that's why you saw yesterday, 60-year-old people, people who have grandchildren who are storming the Capitol. Let me go back to what Drew said. This is not normal. And it's going to take years before it goes away. And in the process, security is at stake.
All right, I hate to end on this more pessimistic note, obviously, but I really appreciate it. I want, just considering we've been at this now for 90 minutes, I want to wrap it up, and but most certainly I hope we can continue this discussion in the coming weeks. I think we need to continue this discussion. Listening to what we've talked about, I think I would very much also like to put together a panel, talk a little bit about the global response to this. We've talked a lot about, the effect on the American democracy and on the US, but what does it do for our, international politics and for our standing in the world, really? I think that is very, very important to look into that as well. So we will be back. I hope there will be not another event like yesterday that will trigger it. I hope we can just come peacefully together and continue this conversation, and we will keep advertising this. I want to make one shameless plug here at the end. The Edwards College is launching a new center that will launch this fall, actually, on occasion of the 20th anniversary of the Edwards College, and it will be called the Center for Inclusive Excellence and have undergraduate student fellows in there, as well as faculty fellows and graduate students. And we set a topic for the center for its first year, and we picked the topic Narratives of Democracy, and we couldn't have picked a better topic, clearly, to discuss in the center and with our colleagues and our faculty and our students. So there will be more on that coming in the next months as well. I would like to thank all of you, all the panelists. This was really helpful, really insightful. Would like to thank our audience. We had a very large and very diverse audience. and we got a lot of very good questions. The comments will stay on Facebook. Hopefully we can all go and take a look at them again and answer some of the questions we couldn't address in the discussion. So thank you, everybody, and be safe. And we will continue this important discussion. Thanks.